My name is Rabbi Or Rose. I'm the director of the Miller Center for Interreligious Learning and Leadership of Hebrew College. And I'm sorry I can't be with you in person, but a medical issue arose, and so I needed to stay in Boston. But I'm thankful to all of you for coming, both online and in person. And I'll start by framing this. When the pandemic first erupted in this country, like so many other people, I scoured to think about how I might be useful and how my work as a rabbi and an educator, both within the Jewish community and interreligiously, might be put to use in ways that could provide people with support and with resources and community. And so one of the projects that we developed was called Psalm Season. And we developed it in collaboration with the Interfaith Youth Corps, which is now called Interfaith America. The idea for the project was to dedicate 18 weeks, the number 18 being numerically equivalent in Hebrew to the word for life, chai. And we were desperate, of course, for life. And so we thought we'll spend 18 weeks exploring the book of Psalms, each week exploring through a variety of modalities, one psalm. And one of the reasons, of course, why we chose the book of Psalms, and I'll say more about this in a moment, is because it is this exquisite ancient collection of theological, social, political, and emotional voices. And we felt like it was and is a playlist for real life, particularly in a time of great pain and suffering, of anxiety and isolation. The book of Psalms includes all of those voices and feelings very vividly. So we launched this project and moved through the first few weeks of it. And then, in addition to COVID, George Floyd was murdered. And so we were dealing with the eruption yet again of another deeply seated illness in the United States, and that, of course, is racism. And so over the course of the full 18 weeks and beyond, we actually gathered some beautiful, heart-wrenching, painful, celebratory, hopeful array of voices. And what I wanted to do with you in our time today is share some of those voices, particularly those of people from minority communities, and to see how contemporary folks in those communities interacted with dynamically this ancient collection of prayer poems and their own life circumstances individually, communally, nationally, and globally. And I want to focus specifically on one psalm, given the limitations of the session. And I chose Psalm 137. Why 137? Because it is one of the strongest and in some ways most disturbing Psalms of lament. Before going to Psalm 137, I just want to make sure that we start on a level playing field, which is to say, the book of Psalms may be familiar to some of you, may even be an intimate resource for some of you, but for others of you, may be a term that you've heard, but you know very little about. So let me just say a few words to frame what the book of Psalms is, how it's been used as a sacred resource primarily by Jews and Christians over the centuries, and then we'll look at 137 and the contemporary voices in relationship to this ancient prayer poem and some of its antecedents and earlier voices of interpretation. So the book of Psalms in its editing is patterned after the Pentateuch, the Torah. So it's divided into 5 books. And that was intentional as a way of articulating that whomever edited it wanted it to be a sacred source like the Torah. There are also within the book of Psalms different clusters based on themes, ideas, visions, etc. Numbering the Psalms, as you may know, if you're Christian and have gone to a Jewish house of worship, or Christian and gone to a Jewish and gone to a Christian house of worship, or Jewish and gone to that, they're numbered differently sometimes. And that's based on translation and the manuscripts that are being used. One of the most interesting things about the book of Psalms is that the tradition grew after the close of the canon that King David was the author either of the entire Psalms or most of the Psalms. But that's not actually the assumption by the writers and editors of the Psalms themselves, nor is that shared today by most scholars that tease apart how the book was brought together. But we do know by the early centuries of the Common Era that it was an incredibly important book for Jews and Christians, including, for example, the fact that it's the most often quoted book, biblical book in the New Testament, and it was a core part of the Dead Sea Scrolls library, a group of sectarian Jews that also regarded it as a sacred source of prayer, celebration, lamentation, etc. And for centuries, as you know, Jews and Christians have used it extensively. Of course, Jews and Christians have not often talked about how they use it or what they might learn from each other if they share how this has been a resource. Muslims also regard the book of Psalms as sacred, though they don't use it liturgically commonly in the ways that Jews and Christians do. As I said, the Psalms can be grouped by genre, as a hymn, a lament, a psalm of royalty, of thanksgiving. Some are national in focus and contain snippets of history. Some are pleas for protection, thanksgiving for victory. One of the things that I think is most powerful and why the book of Psalms has endured is that more than half of the Psalms are articulated in the first person singular. It's the voice of the I, and not just the vaunted or royal voice of I, King David, or some other great figure, but an ordinary person that's celebrating or struggling. And then there are a variety of Psalms too, which mix voices, which also creates fascinating kinds of dynamics theologically and emotionally. Finally, right, which is obvious, is that there is a wide variety of emotion. So as I said at the outset, I really think of the Psalms as a playlist for real life. Why is the book of Psalms called Psalms or the Psalter? Because psalmoi in Greek is instrumental music. Tehillim, the original Hebrew term for the book of Psalms, means praises, which tells you something powerful theologically about the book as a whole. First of all, that these Psalms were intended to be enacted. You could think of the text that we have as the libretto for the performance of the Psalms, first in the temple and then in a variety of different contexts. And we don't know exactly how they were used in the ancient world, but it's fascinating to think about, particularly as contemporary religious leaders, how might we use this for pastoral care, for communal liturgy, for personal devotion or meditation? How could this be sung? How could this be represented visually? How could this be danced? How could this be fill in the blanks? And one of the reasons, of course, why King David is associated with the Psalms is because of this term Tehillim and then psalmoi, right? Because King David was considered to be a great musician and poet in addition to being a fierce warrior. The other thing is that it's called praises or Tehillim because for all of the expressions of lament, the book of Psalms ends on a note of great hope. So Walter Brueggemann, who's a great Christian scholar of the Hebrew Bible, says of the book of Psalms, think about its movement as one from orientation to disorientation to reorientation. And all of those are respected in the book of Psalms. I am oriented, I am disoriented, and I am reoriented. Here is a powerful statement by two contemporary scholars who helped us write the introduction about the nature of lament and the spiritual life. Could someone read it for us? I don't know people's names, so if someone could just volunteer, that would be great.
I can do it.
Thank you.
My readers assume that the Bible is a pure, how do you say that? Pure book, and as such, it
It's a
should
pious book. Yeah.
pious book, and as such, it should not have passages that question God's behavior. But ancient Israel believed that God has a personal side to which the worshiper and the larger nation can appeal in very personal language. Much of the continuing power of this fascinating book is that it compliantly communicates the pain and suffering that are too frequently a part of our human experience. It might be said that the theme that pervades these psalms is distress. Some have estimated that lament psalms constitute over half of the psalms in the Psalter.
The Psalter, silent P.
Psalter. Many of these psalms contain insight concerning the articulation of pain and how one learns to work through life's difficulties and still embrace God.
Okay. So over half the Psalms deal with lament. And then the question is, what can we learn from these expressions of lament, of pain and suffering, individual, communal, or larger? One of the pieces of music that we commissioned at the very beginning of this project was from a colleague of ours in the DC area. You can see the words from Marty Lamar on the left, and I'll play the video for you because when I asked Marty, who is a church worship leader, what he would choose of his own to play in the days following the murder of George Floyd as it relates to the theme of the Psalms and lament, he chose this piece. So I want you to listen and would love to hear what it evokes in you, because again, these Psalms were intended to be performed. They're supposed to be evocative spiritually, emotionally, socially, and otherwise. Let me know if you can hear. Ooh. Sorry, this may be a technical difficulty. Working a minute ago. I'm going to stop sharing and then I'm going to share again. I'm going to optimize.
Or go back into presenter mode. I think it should work now.
Sorry, thank you for being patient and helping. I'm going to leave it here for the moment. Sorry.
What about that little boy? Put on his head and now he is dead. And what about that corner man trying to make a way? They took his breath away. It seems these crimes will not end. How much longer can we pretend? Where's the justice, the peace for all? Lord, we cry, hear our call. Lord, we pray that justice will prevail. We know you won't fail. And Lord, we pray that you will hear our call and justice will fall like rain. Like rain. What about that mother there forced to say goodbye? Lord, her daughter died. What happened? Nobody knows. 3 days in life, no more. Her dreams lay on the floor. It seems these crimes will not end. How much longer will we pretend? Where's the justice, the peace for all? Lord, we cry, hear our call. Lord, we pray that justice will prevail. We know you won't fail. And
So I'm going to stop here, and I just want you to take note of when Marty actually first wrote this. Do you see at the top of the screen?
No, it's cut off.
It's too small.
Okay, so I'll move into presenter mode, as Tom suggested, and see if that helps. Can you see it?
Yes.
Right. So it wasn't 2020 when the pandemic arose, and then when George Floyd was murdered. It was originally written in 2015. And I say that because he wrote it after another African-American person was murdered, and a second and a third. And so this is the song and the text that he returned to after George Floyd. And so it was quite painful, to hear him say, this is a song that has become a regular part, too much a regular part of my worship life, and one that connects, as far as he was concerned, to the theme of lament in the book of Psalms. But he also said how important it was to be able to have this ancient resource as a model to express his own lament in a religious context. That to be pious doesn't mean that you don't cry out, that you don't actually express anger or rage. So here's Psalm 137. Could someone read it for us? And I warn you, the end is painful if you're not familiar with it. It's distressing. But if someone could read it.
By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept, and we remembered Zion. There on the poplars, we hung up our lyres, for our captors asked us there for songs. Our tormentors for amusement said, sing us one of the songs of Zion. How can we sing a song of the Lord on alien soil? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my left hand wither. Let my tongue stick to my palate. If I cease to think of you, I do not keep Jerusalem in memory, even at my happiest hour. Remember, O Lord, the Edomites on the day of Jerusalem's fall, that now how they cried, strip her to her very foundations. Daughter Babylon, you predator, a blessing on one who repays you in kind or what you have inflicted upon us. a blessing on the one who seizes your babies and dashes them against the rock.
What do you make of this psalm? How would you describe it? What captures your attention? Just call it out.
Painful.
Painful. What else?
Anger.
Anger, pain, anger,
Frustration.
frustration. What else?
Loss and revenge.
Loss, and 7 through 9, those last verses, revenge. Anything else?
Audacity.
Audacity, that's a good term. Right? Just 9 lines, but a lot of emotion. Pain, anger, frustration, loss, revenge, audacity, all compacted in this prayer poem. Now, you know that there have been a variety of creative interpretations of this psalm. One famous one in American folk music was by Don McLean in the late 1960s, early 70s. And another of the first groups that we invited to participate were 3 women that are part of a indie rock feminist group, 2 Jewish women and 1 African-American woman called Betty. So I just want to play you a snippet of their interpretation, and you'll notice where they are and how they recorded this. Remember those early days of the pandemic and how people were trying to express themselves artistically.
By the waters of Babylon, we lay down and wept for thee, Zion. We remember thee, Zion. By the waters of Babylon, we lay down and wept for thee, Zion. We remember thee, Zion. We remember thee, Zion. We lay down and wept for thee, Zion. We remember thee, Zion. We remember thee, Zion.
So what does that video evoke in you? Thinking about which piece of the psalm they used, where they were, how they recorded, what they're saying. Call it out again.
Remember, we remember.
Memory, right? Memory of what?
Weeping.
Pardon?
Or weeping.
Weeping, memory of weeping, right?
Memory of before exile, of before being trapped.
Right, memory both of exile, that is models of exile, right? We're not alone, other people have been through this, but also what was it like before we were isolated? Each of them is in a separate place. Remember, that's how people made music for a long time over the last 2.5 years, right? So we're not alone, and we remember. There's a double remembering that they talk about in explaining why they chose this as, you know, their first expression related to the Psalms and to the pandemic. These 3 women that have been making music together, and for whom making music is a spiritual act. So how could they, as the psalmist says, make music when their Zion, quote unquote, their Jerusalem, right, has been taken from them? When they can't be together in a studio, when they can't be together to harmonize, when they can't be together to put their arms around each other. You know, what does it mean? So there is a memory, right, of an earlier exile. There is mention, of course, of the possibility of singing or the impossibility of singing. But of course, the psalm itself is paradoxical because it's a psalm about not being able to sing, but in which the psalmist and people forever after have sung as a kind of act of rebellion, you might say, spiritual rebellion against the exile and the torment of people that said, sing your national song, sing the song of your homeland. But how can we do that here? We're not in our homeland. And so they sing anyways. Here are some questions that I often ask people as they look through this text about associations with which you come to the psalm, the role of music in your spiritual life, what the word Zion and Jerusalem mean in this context, right? I just use that metaphorically to describe the women from Betty. The places in your own town and city where you feel more or less at home. And then those very difficult closing lines. Should they be a part of our liturgy? They're not usually, right? We pick and choose in Judaism and Christianity very selectively. But if we don't say them, if we don't chant them, sing them, cry them, right, in our houses of worship, do they just stand? And is that okay? Or do we talk about them or explore them elsewhere? So just a couple of notes about the psalm, right, which are obvious. Why is it so painful to try and sing in the land of Babylon? Because it's not only an exile from the land, but from the culture. It's from this word Bavel in Hebrew that we have Babel. All I can do is babble. I can't speak meaningfully because I'm wrenched from all that I know. And then two, there we sat, there we wept. Why is that repeated? Just to underscore how painful it is to be in exile. It should be here, but we are there. Verse 5. Look at how this psalm has been used by different interpreters, skillful interpreters over the centuries. Someone read this, please.
Fellow citizens, above your national tumultuous joy, I hear the mournful wail of millions whose chains, heavy and grievous yesterday, are today rendered more intolerable by the jubilee shouts that reach them. If I do forget, if I do not faithfully remember those bleeding children of sorrow this day, may my right hand forget her cunning, and may my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. To forget them, to pass lightly over their wrongs, and to chime in with the popular theme would be treason most scandalous and shocking, and would make me a reproach before God and the world. My subject then, fellow citizens, is American slavery. I shall see this day and its popular characteristics from the slave's point of view.
What is Frederick Douglass doing here so powerfully? Come on, folks, speak up. You're all leaders, educators. What is he doing?
Well, he's getting ready to introduce his theme, and he picks a poignant way of comparing what happened then to what's going on now. And of course, that would only mean something to a group that was familiar with scripture.
Right.
He's talking to people who are or should be or have presented themselves as being spiritualists.
Exactly. You said it so beautifully. Say more. Keep on going. You are rolling.
Well, I just left a session where you're not supposed to talk. Keep talking. So I'm supposed to step back now.
Okay. Well, I love every word that you said, because he's doing something that is deft. He is here in the United States, which is supposed to be the land of freedom, of liberty, of opportunity. It's supposed to be a new Zion. This is the celebration, the 76th celebration of what? The Declaration of Independence. But independence for whom?
Right.
And in the creation of the United States of America, right? There is, of course, freedom of religion. And he also knows that many of the people assembled and who came before him considered themselves to be religious people, as you just said, who would say, I consider this to be a sacred text. But what he's doing is saying, this is not just a sacred text, it's a challenge. Are you living the values of the Bible? Or are you giving lip service to the values of the Bible? What else do you hear or see? Someone pick up on that thread.
An indictment.
It's an indictment. Say more.
Well, this was the speech to what is the 4th of July to the slave. I might be saying it wrong. And it was an indictment against the system that he was presenting, an argument for the freedoms of Blacks in America versus the freedoms that were supposed to be for all that were present.
Right. Beautifully said. And the way that he's doing that, right, exegetically, is he's saying, if I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. So what does it mean, right? He's asking in this day and age in 1852, if I forget the bleeding children of sorrow, may my right hand forget her cunning, and may my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth, right? That is he and everyone else that is celebrating independence. If we forget those that are still in bondage, then a curse upon us. How dare we say that we are living in the land of freedom, because what we're doing is actually keeping others in exile while we're celebrating the freedoms that this land offers us. I think it's an ingenious use of verse 5. Now, verse 6 is related directly to this question about freedom and pain. Have any of you ever been to a Jewish wedding? Raise your hand. See the owl with some movement. Yes, no? Okay, what happens at the end of a Jewish wedding?
They stomp on glass.
Right. The groom or the groom and bride, or the bride or one of the grooms or one of the brides stomps on the glass. Lisa Lewis, I see your hand up.
Sorry, I was just raising my hand because I'd been at a Jewish wedding.
Great, okay. Why at a Jewish wedding, which is supposed to be a great celebration, do you break a glass at the end of it and say, let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, if I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy? Why would you do that?
Well, it's to commemorate the, one of the interpretations is that it's to commemorate the destruction of Jerusalem, and so that we should not forget it even at this time of joy.
Right. That's the explanation that's given here by this late medieval interpreter, Moses Isserlis. And he says there's another accompanying tradition, which is very powerful, which you wouldn't expect at a wedding, is that the groom places ashes on his head before the ceremony. It relates in my heart and mind to what Frederick Douglass was saying, which is, we know that we live in a world which is not yet fully redeemed. And so at a Jewish wedding, where Jerusalem is the symbol of completeness, of wholeness, because the root for Jerusalem comes from the Hebrew word shalem. Yerushalayim, shalem means whole, but the world is broken apart. It's like all of those shards of glass. And so the Jewish wedding, you celebrate. You are happy, you are festive, you eat, you drink, and you dance, but you take a moment or two or three and you say, the world is not whole, it is still broken. There are so many other people that are still suffering. And so we commit ourselves as a couple and as a community when we leave this celebration to help others have the opportunity to celebrate. Does that make sense? Give me a head nod, right? Right. So it's a challenge. It's a celebration, but it's also a challenge. Now, watch this video set to those same words, to this song. But I want you to ask yourself what they omit, what they include and what they omit.
By the waters of Babylon, we laid our lyres down, laid our lyres down. We sat and cried. By the waters of Babylon, we sang no sacred songs, sang no sacred songs. Our tongues were tied. Whoa, oh, oh, oh. Did I lie? Oh, no, no. Did I? Oh, did I? Oh, oh, oh. Did I? Na, na, na. Oh, oh, oh. Did I? La, la, oh, did I? Na, na. Hey. If I forget you, Jerusalem, I'll play no more again, play no more again, not one more time. Won't you show me Jerusalem, raised and broken, raised and broken, alone on high.
Okay. First of all, this is just kind of a wonderful example of cultural fusion. This group of young American Jews, several of whom are from the South, piecing together Hasidic, Eastern European nigun style chant, right, with the bluegrass of their motherland. What do they include and what do they not include? What verses did they omit?
Dashing babies.
Right.
They left out our captors demanded of us mirth.
Right. So they focus on the pain of Babylon and, right, the tongue in the hand, but they say nothing about the end. They say nothing about the end, and that's very common in Jewish and Christian circles because many people feel it's inappropriate. Look at the Pope, right? There should be no psalms that are imprecatory. It's just improper to call out and cry and lament and ask for revenge. There's an interpretation by Ignatius, Saint Ignatius, right? He says this should all be understood internally, right? Psychologized. This is not about taking revenge on another, which is an interesting way of dealing with the verse, right? He deals with it, but it's not usually included in liturgy. Here is a contemporary voice that I found to be very powerful. It's Reverend Dr. Leslie Callahan from Philadelphia. Could someone read it for us? I think you'll find it really interesting and provocative.
Can someone online read it? Because it's slightly cut off on our projector is all. So if someone online could read it, that'd be great.
Okay. Someone want to read? Lisa Lewis, want to read?
Sure. Last year, with a milestone birthday looming and a pastoral sabbatical beckoning, I made plans to travel to the continent of Africa. And while I associated with an apocalyptic phrase from the tradition of the spirituals, as soon as my feet strike Zion, with the visit, I had no conscious expectation that anything earth-shattering would occur during the trip. I simply felt that I was behind schedule when it came to Africa, and it was past time to get there. Following an overnight flight, my feet touched for the first time the soil that gave birth to humanity, Africa, the mother of us all. I sighed. Standing on the shores of the Atlantic and looking west, I confronted the pain, sadness, and rage of my ancestors' displacement. Our group retraced our people's steps and walked back through the door of no return. Have you ever seen child-sized shackles? While you imagine them, try to grasp not just the sadness, but also the rage. This kind of rage could easily manifest as it does in the concluding words of Psalm 137, a desperate cry to avenge terrible violations inflicted on innocent children by their captors. People who brutalize children don't usually stop until someone or something else stronger makes them stop. The irony and tension of exile is that we make our home in places that we know on a cellular level are never fully home. But it is not just indignities of this land that reminded us that another land exists. It's also the soul deep refusal to forget that someplace beyond any specific geographical location, more like home, exists. It is the ancestors, whoops, where it went. Whoops, okay. It is the ancestors singing in our ears of the places we come from and destinations yet unseen. It is a life-giving determination to live in the beauty of that unseen home. Perhaps that is why at the very moment we question how we can sing the holy song in a strange land, we do so by means of a song.
So briefly, as we wind down our time together, what is Leslie Callahan saying? Just call it out. What do you hear her saying? Because she's saying a few things that I think are really powerful.
She's talking about, or seems to talk about her feeling about what happened in the spots where she is, and that ultimately the only way to deal with it is through a song.
So the US is not fully home. Africa is not fully home, but she's going to continue to yearn and hope for home. And what does the psalm allow her to do? Knowing the pain that happens here and there, the injustices that were committed and are committed against African Americans here and there.
She acknowledges her own rage, and she also, she speaks of the shackles and the size of those small shackles and talks about fertilizing children. She actually is addressing that last verse of the psalm.
Exactly, very beautifully put. I think her pastoral message is we have to deal with the rage. We have to deal with the pain. We have to deal with the disappointment. We have to deal with all those things that people assume you should not deal with in quote unquote religious contexts, because otherwise they will leak, they will gush, right? It doesn't answer the question of when or where you address these and how you address them, right? I think that's a fascinating question for all of us. Do you include this in your liturgy? Or is it in contexts like this, where we tease it apart and we ask how this can be used productively?
And or you kind of mentioned this earlier, but I keep getting caught by that last line and how the inherent, it's sort of life is that inherent the contradiction of how can we possibly sing this stuff, but how can we do anything other than sing to get through it? And only by joining in the song can you live life, even though it's like this catch-22.
Right, exactly, right? How do we buoy ourselves? How do we give ourselves the opportunity to call out, to cry, to celebrate, so that we can live fruitful lives without cutting ourselves off from what is painful, from what is disturbing? Here's the last slide that I want to share with you. Just look at the one on the left. Tom, if you just read it for me briefly.
I can't read it all, but one of these days, is that the first word? Oh,
Yeah.
One of these days will be a festival and a judgment, and our enemies will be thrown into the pit while we rejoice and sing hymns. Some people actually think this way.
So that is the poet laureate, Alicia Oestreicher. Right? And she loves the Psalms, and she says she hates the songs, but she can't live without the songs, right? Because what she's pointing out is some people actually believe this. Some people make ideologies out of this. We wouldn't necessarily need conferences like the one that we are closing, right? If people didn't think and feel and then act in these ways. So Oestreicher says, I'm going to create a counter song, right? In which she very kind of skillfully, painfully, but with a certain kind of irony says, some people actually believe this, right? It's a different note. There's the pastoral voice and then there's the poetic voice, right? To jar us and to ask, so what do we do with materials like this? And how quickly, right, are we willing to weaponize them? So, with that, I just want to thank you all for taking this little tour through the ancient world, the medieval world, and the modern world, trying to think about sacred resources, whose voices have been included, whose voices have been excluded, who brings new, different, and fresh insights, where, when, how, and why. And then what do we do, not only with the pieces of liturgy and of text and of tradition that we love and celebrate and are proud of, but also the pieces that distress, that anger, that frustrate, that challenge our sensibilities? Is it still possible to mind those so that we become the people that we ought to be? So thank you all very much. Have a wonderful, wonderful evening. If you're interested in the slides, I'm happy to send them. Just give your name and your information to Tom. He's my colleague, and I'll send you a PDF version of it. And keep on singing, keep on dancing, keep on crying, keep on smiling. When it's safe, hug other people. And peace be with you. Bye.